Hey, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. We're glad you're tuning into this episode. We are a viewer and listener supported podcast, so we really appreciate you listening, watching on YouTube. We really encourage you to subscribe to whatever platform you're using. If you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, or if you're on Apple or however you listen to a podcast, be sure and subscribe. We greatly appreciate it. Also, make comments if you like it and share it if you like it. We really need people to make comments and share the episodes that you like. And then also, if you're not already a supporter, we really would encourage you to go to spiritualityadventures.com and you can pick a tier, and we have bonus content for every type of giver. This is a nonprofit, so they're tax-deductible donations, but we do provide bonus content for those who are supporters. So be a part of the team, help support Spirituality Adventures, and we're so glad you're tuning into this episode. All right, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. Thanks for tuning into this episode. And by the way, this is Holy Week. We're going to release this. We're recording this on Tuesday of Holy Week in 2024, and this will be released tomorrow on Wednesday of Holy Week. And I'm talking with Brian Zahnd, who has been an acquaintance and colleague for decades, but actually just probably in the last year or so I drove up to St. Joe and told you my whole meltdown story. You loved me anyway, Brian. Thank you so much.
Love you, Fred. I'm here. I'll be with you when the deal goes down.
So Brian is now my most interviewed guest on Spirituality Adventures over the last 4 years. We've released almost close, probably getting close to 200 episodes, man. Is that right? Wow. Something like that. And so this is Brian's new book that's called The Wood Between the Worlds. The Wood Between the Worlds. And he's calling it a poetic theology of the cross. So a type of theopoetic of the cross. And man, you come at this thing with lots of stories that tie into the various themes of the cross. And it's a great read. I'd encourage everybody to get it, and especially during Holy Week, you can. Is there an audio out yet on it?
There is, and I recorded the audio myself. For me, that's hard work. I went to Chicago and over 3 days recorded that thing. So yeah, it's out. It's available.
So you can listen or read, and it's a great read for Holy Week and beyond. The center point of this Christian faith is the cross, don't you think? So this book is about that. So I kind of wanted to start off, Brian, by maybe critiquing a couple of the misunderstandings of the cross that we grew up with in our evangelical heritage and background. I'm guessing, I think as I go back and think of all the messages I've preached about giving your life to Jesus and the cross and all that happened there, I think that I've probably done a few versions in my early years that I wouldn't subscribe to now.
Yeah.
And right. I think you're probably the same.
Yes, certainly.
And so let's do a quick critique on maybe one or two of probably the most misunderstood aspects of the cross as it relates to the way we learned the gospel message growing up in our evangelical roots.
Yeah, let me just give a little church history lesson
off the bat.
Yeah. So I'm used to talking about this. What you are alluding to, and which I never actually name in the book, but what we are talking about is what is known as penal substitutionary atonement theory. Mm-hmm. It is a theory that I describe as an invasive species within the theology of the cross. It seems to have just taken over and driven out the diversity of ways of talking about the cross that should be present. This is a phenomenon in Western Christianity. The Orthodox, the Eastern half of Christianity, has never talked like this. And when they hear what passes for penal substitutionary atonement theory, they're generally aghast. They're saying, "You what? You what? You say that?" And basically, it's this. And then I'll give you the history, that God is punishing Jesus at the cross, that ultimately the ultimate source of violence on Good Friday is from God, so that the cross becomes the place where God pours out his wrath upon his son in order that he might gain the wherewithal to forgive. And when you say, Fred, that you grew up with that and you preached various versions of it, well, we all did. That's why I describe it as an invasive species. I think it's aberrant, and its history is this. We go all the way back 1,000 years, or almost 1,000 years, to Anselm of Canterbury, who was working on a theological project to try to understand why God became human. And basically, he arrives at this conclusion that, and it's important that you understand that he is writing in the Middle Ages in a shame-honor society. And Anselm posits
the book right off my shelf right over there.
Yeah.
Why God became man. Yeah.
That's the name of it. Or sometimes they put it in Latin, but in English it's Why God Became Human. Mm-hmm. And he says, well, human sin has been an affront to the honor of God. God's honor has been impugned, and now God must regain his honor. Now, in these feudal medieval societies, this was all very important, and class was very rigid, so that if a peasant insults a nobleman, the nobleman cannot recover his honor by punishing the peasant, because they're not equal. So perhaps the nobleman can find another nobleman that this peasant is connected to, and he can go confront him and take off his glove and slap him in the face and say, "Give me satisfaction, sir." And they have a duel or something like that. So Anselm goes on from there and he says, well, how could God regain his honor? Who is equal to God? Oh, the Son of God becomes human, that he might be punished and God could recover his honor. Then you get another 500 years into this, and it's John Calvin primarily, who doesn't make it so much about honor as he makes it about wrath. That God's wrath must be satisfied, and ultimately it's satisfied by being poured out onto the Son. This is where the idea comes about that the ultimate source of violence on Good Friday is the Father. Well, this made sense to me until I got serious about theology about 20 years ago, and then it totally didn't make sense. I saw the violence that it does to the Trinity. Yeah. I saw how it impugns the goodness of the Father. The cross is not what God inflicts upon Christ in order to forgive. The cross is what God in Christ endures as he forgives. The cross is not where, and this is so important, the cross is not where Jesus saves us from God. The cross is where Jesus reveals God as Savior. The Father and the Son are always in union. Jesus says, I only say what the Father says. I only do what the Father does. The Father and I are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So when Jesus prays, Father, forgive them, he's not acting as an agent of change upon the Father. If you have good, solid, orthodox theology, you understand that God is immutable. God is not subject to change. God doesn't mutate. And so the Son never acts as an agent of change upon the Father. The Son is the perfect revelation of the Father. So when praying, Father, forgive them, the Father is saying, yes, Son, of course, that's who we are. And so we can go further if you want, but that's a quick summary of penal substitutionary atonement theory.
Yeah.
And my critique of it. I could critique a lot. And in this book,
I want to dig.
I actually spend more time critiquing this in a previous book. There's 2 chapters, Sinners in the Hands of Loving God.
Right.
And I spend more time with, and this one I didn't, I kind of deal with it up front fairly quickly, and then maybe a time or two refer to it. But what I really wanted to do was say, look how many ways there are of understanding and talking about the cross that fall within the generous bounds of historic Christian orthodoxy. And one last point, Fred, and then I'll stop for a moment. Even if penal substitutionary atonement theory is an adequate way of describing what happens on Good Friday, and I do not think it is. I think it's not only aberrant but abhorrent. But even if it were an adequate way of describing Good Friday, it is problematic in that it simply obliterates all other meanings. Once people adopt that atonement theory, it becomes to them the gospel, even though it's not. It becomes the gospel. And so do you ever hear them talking about how the cross shames the principalities and powers? No, they completely go scot-free. So I think it's a real problem in Western theology that, to be honest, its grip, at least at the more serious levels of academic theology, is weakening. It's not as nearly as broadly accepted. Yeah. Among our best theologians as it was 50 years ago. Right. And, it's N.T. Wright that describes it as a paganized soteriology, which is just in typical N.T. Wright fashion is very memorable. A paganized soteriology.
Yeah. I remember reading John Stott's book, The Cross of Christ, and he defends substitutionary atonement in that book. And I thought of all the authors I read,
I don't even mind saying substitutionary. It's the penal part that is the problem.
Right. Because Stott worked very hard to show that it was God in Christ, not God against Christ.
Yeah.
And so, but then I began to rethink this. So like N.T. Wright. So give us a little bit how, does God have to kill somebody to forgive? Mm-hmm. Does God have to kill an innocent person to forgive?
Yeah. So you have this issue.
Pagan atonement theories that called for, and dive into that just a brief bit.
Well, usually the argument is that this was necessary to satisfy justice.
Right.
So then I imagine it's something like this. Okay, so you don't want to impugn the Father's character as being less than unconditionally loving. So is it like this? Hey, everybody, look, I'd love to forgive you. I'm a loving God. I am love. But I have to satisfy justice. Mm-hmm. And I want to say, well, then who's in charge here? I mean, you would love to, but your manager won't let you. Mm-hmm. I mean, who is in charge here? And then there's the problem of how in the world is not only the punishment, but the violent torture and execution of an innocent person. Well, how does that satisfy justice? No, that satisfies injustice. If things are completely confused, that is not it. And there's a particularly American impulse to equate justice with punishment.
Right.
Somebody's got to get punished. So think about the most famous parable, the most beloved parable, sometimes described as the gospel in the Gospels, the prodigal son. If you incorporate penal substitutionary atonement theology into the parable of the prodigal son, it has to go something like this. And when the father saw the son a long way off, he felt compassion and he ran to the servants' quarters, where he beat the hell out of a whipping boy and satisfied his wrath, and then was able to embrace us. Well, there's nothing like that. We don't need that ugly insertion. Right. There is, though. Well, see, in the parable of the prodigal son, there's no restitution. There's nothing recovered. What must pass for justice is simply the restoration of the relationship between the father and the son. But there is an appeal for there to be at least some kind of equating punishment with justice in the parable, and it comes from the older brother, mm-hmm. who is upset that the father has freely forgiven and brought out the fatted calf and the party's on, and the elder brother refuses to come to the party because there hasn't been punishment. Right. And, the parable just then ends. We don't really know what the conclusion is, but I would describe the elder brother refusing to attend the party, very upset and angry, as in the outer darkness, gnashing and weeping, gnashing his teeth. And so
But the father even goes out to the older son even.
And that's the father's out there with him at the end of the parable.
The end, yeah.
So
isn't that fascinating?
I just think we have some wrong ideas about the character, God, justice, the Trinity. It's a train wreck, actually. Yeah. It's actually a train wreck because you import violence into the Trinity.
Yeah.
You have the Father acting in violent ways toward the Son. So is it like this? So let's just play with it a little bit. Does God say, well, okay, all right. I'm willing to forgive. I'm with you there. But there's got to be some punishment. There's got to be a death. Death of a sinless one. All right. So incarnation, Son of God. But does the Father say, well, so we said, well, can it be like, just a quick painless death? I mean, just, maybe a beheading just as quick as possible. No, I think, no, I want it to be lingering. I want it to be very painful. You know what? I want a scourging. We got to have a scourging first. Thorns. I want a crown of thorn. So if I start pushing people like this, well, some of this was human gratuitous violence. Well, explain this division of labor about how, some of it's from God and some of it's just human cruelty. It makes no sense. But that's why I do in the book, I do say the impulse to connect the cross with forgiveness is a proper instinct.
Yes.
And there's ways to do it without impugning the character of the Father and doing violence to the Trinity.
Correct. I think Bertrand Russell wrote a book called Why I'm Not a Christian. Mm-hmm. And he took this Western penal substitutionary view and just attacked it, because why would you want to worship a father who has to kill an innocent person to forgive a guilty person? And that just, like, who would want
and every Eastern Orthodox theologian was, we never said that. Right. We've never once said that.
Yeah.
And I have literally met people. I mean, not just, I've read Bertrand Russell, but I have met people who have told me I am not a Christian because I don't believe in child abuse.
Right.
And the way the gospel had been told to them is that the Father had to abuse the Son so that he could forgive us.
Yeah, exactly. And in the polytheistic world, that idea existed. You had angry gods who need to be appeased. They're little babies. And you have to sacrifice your kid or an animal or something.
Throw the virgin in the volcano or something. Yeah.
Yeah. And this
is why N.T. Wright calls it he's not just flinging around pejoratives. That's not his style. That's why he calls it a paganized. Yeah. What he's saying is it comes from a Gentile concept of sacrifice, not a Jewish concept. Yeah. So think, for example, of the Passover lamb.
Passover week. Why is the Passover lamb different than the appeasing of the gods? It's in your book.
I know this stuff. So the lamb provides the meal. The lamb is the place where the covenant is ratified. So the lamb, the yearling male without blemish, is brought into the house on the 10th of Nisan. 4 days later, it is slain, but it's not tortured. The command was not, yes, and you shall scourge the lamb and then get a little crown of thorns and put it on his head. And the lamb is not being punished. The lamb is not being punished. The lamb is providing the meal that will ratify the covenant. And that's why in the upper room, Jesus reimagines the Passover celebration as what will become the Christian Eucharistic meal, a not completely newly invented, but a newly imagined communal covenant meal. And so in Hebrew sacrifice, the gods are not being appeased and the animals are not being punished, but rather the covenant is being established, at the heart of which is a meal. And that's very different. That's not the pagan version. We're not appeasing the gods.
The covenant of grace.
Yeah.
And to quote one of my favorite new authors, when grace is pierced, it bleeds
pardon.
Is that you? Did you come up with that?
That's a sentence from me. Yes, it is.
I love that. I was like, I've got several highlighted here. Brian, good job. When grace is, say it again.
When grace is pierced, it bleeds pardon.
Pardon.
So I describe it, there's different ways you could describe it, but I say it like this. On Good Friday, the sins of the world, I mean, the great mass of human sin, from the first Stone Age murder to the final space age iniquity, past, present, future sins that we would think are terrible, or sins that we think perhaps are minor. All the sin of the world, lust, greed, hate, violence, pride, whatever. It all coalesces into a hideous singularity and becomes the sin of the world. It becomes a single thing. And it becomes the worst sin possible. If you ask people, what's the worst sin? Most people will say, well, it's some type of murder. But, there's homicide, but then there's fratricide, murder of a brother. There's patricide, murder of a father. I mean, how terrible. What's the worst possible? How about deicide, the murder of God? The sin of the world coalesces on Good Friday into a hideous singularity that it might be forgiven in mass. The worst sin possible is happening. Father, forgive them. Mm-hmm. And so God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them. Mm-hmm. Remember, God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, not reconciling himself to the world.
That's right.
Okay. The agent of change is to work upon us, not upon God.
Yeah. And how I've thought of this, like if I forgive somebody that's hurt me deeply, basically what's happening is I absorb the pain, the hurt. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I let them go free.
Exactly. And I think I might even use that language in the book. I don't know if I use the word absorb. I think I do.
And I see it that way, is that
we absorb it.
Is the model of forgiveness of the heart of God, absorbing all of that, all of the things that his kids have done to hurt each other and to hurt the world and to hurt the planet and to hurt the heart of God, are being absorbed to the very heart of God. Demonstrated.
And so related to this is we use the language redeem. Even a more precise word is ransom, that shows up twice in the New Testament. And what's happened, though, is people have gotten confused about who the recipient of the ransom payment is. Somehow they've imagined that this is a ransom paid to God. God is not the abductor. Right. We are not being held hostage by God. In fact, what the word ransom really means, and it's found in Matthew and Mark parallel passages where Jesus says, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. And then similar language shows up in some of the anthems in the book of Revelation. Well, this is the manumission fee. In other words, this was a price that was paid to buy someone out of slavery. So someone's a slave, someone comes along and says, I want to buy them out of their slavery. And so the price is settled, the payment's made, and the person goes free. Well, we weren't enslaved by God. We were enslaved by death. Mm-hmm. We were enslaved by sin. We were enslaved by the devil. And this is how the church fathers preached it. They didn't talk in terms of atonement theory. That would be far too clinical and academic, but they did use various metaphors. And their favorite metaphor by far was that the death of Christ is a ransom. But the ransom, and there's all kinds of sermons and hymns that talk about this. I mean, they're just, patristics is replete with this. The ransom is paid to death, or sometimes the devil is a personification of death. The ransom is paid to death, but it's tricky because there is a trick involved. It's a ransom that death should never have accepted because it led to death's undoing. Mm-hmm. Because Jesus is fully human, he is mortal and he can die. And so death can swallow Jesus. Mm-hmm. But Jesus is also fully divine, and death cannot digest divinity. And so once Christ goes into death, he actually goes in not as a conquest, but as a conqueror, not as a victim, but as a champion, and death is destroyed. And that's how they preached this. And so as long as we don't get this economic metaphor of ransom or redeem is great, as long as you understand who is and who isn't being paid. By the way, this is what shows up in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that climactic moment when Aslan offers himself on the stone table to be killed by the witch. And he does that. But what happens? Well, not only is Edmund ransomed or redeemed, all of Narnia is. This is the deeper magic. And not actually in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but in other writing, this is C.S. Lewis saying, yeah, this is my atonement theory. I got it from the church fathers. This is how they thought about it.
Good stuff. Good stuff. One other thing as a prelude, and then I picked so many chapters to talk about, we're going to run out of time, but as a prelude to, I'm going to then dive into a couple of the chapters that you did here. But one of the themes that you picked up on is Cain and the symbolism of Cain and what that represents as far as power and violence, and how that in the story of human history, and then how God is love and Jesus is love, and undoing that story of power and violence. I loved the way you worked that Cain imagery through several chapters.
Yeah, anthropologists tell us that at the dawn of sophisticated human civilization, which involves the harnessing of agriculture, and until then we're hunter-gatherers, we're just on the move. But once we learn the principles of agriculture, this allows for the rise of more sophisticated societies, civilizations, division of labor. This is where cities, and then ultimately kings, kingdoms, empires, it all comes from there, from being able to become farmers instead of hunter-gatherers. And so one way of looking at this dreadful story in the opening chapters of Genesis is that there was a man named humankind. This is what Adam means. A woman named living, Heva, and living humankind has two sons. Cain, the elder, a farmer, and then Abel, he's the shepherd. There's tension between them, and Cain is warned. God comes to Cain and says, sin is crouching at your door and its desires for you. You need to overcome this. He doesn't. See, once one of the things that comes with agriculture is that land can now be owned. And if it can be owned, it can be disputed and fought over, which is, the basis of nearly every war is ultimately over whose land is this? Water. And so in a field, of course it's in a field, Cain rises up against his brother and kills him. He has to lie to himself first. He has to say things like, he's not really my brother. He's other. He's enemy. It must be done. It's manifest destiny. I have to have this land. And so I have to do this. And so he lies to himself, slays his brother, hides the body, because we always hide the bodies. And then God comes to him and says, what have you done? I hear your brother's blood. Where is your brother? How would I know? I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Am I supposed to, keep track of my brother like he keeps track of his sheep? Yeah, I hope we know the answer to that question by now. And there's some other things that happen. There's the mark that's put on Cain, which is actually a mark of mercy, so that people don't go after him seeking retribution. But here's the most interesting moment. What happens next is Cain moves east of Eden, and what does he do? He founds the first city. What's the Bible trying to tell us? The Bible is trying to tell us that the origins of our civilization are violent, usually over land. And what we do is we tell ourselves it must be done. We say, well, they're not really my brother. They're other and enemy. We go to war. We murder them. We hide the bodies with our myths and memorials and monuments and anthems and all of that. And then we build our society. And then we repeat it over and over and over and over and over. And this is why Abraham is described as looking for a city whose builder is God, not Cain. He's looking, is there another way to order human civilization that isn't at its core violent? And Jesus says, Abraham, from a distance, he saw my day and he rejoiced. He was glad to see it. Because what Abraham is longing for, a city whose builder and maker is God and not in the way of Cain, is what Jesus Christ builds in his kingdom. And at the center of that is the cross.
Yeah. By the way, a very quick aside that, Kohelet, Ecclesiastes is a extended commentary midrash on the Cain and Abel story. Cain acquire. And so the preacher in Kohelet acquires. And then Hevel is the vanity that's word translated, which is a bad translation of that word, is Abel's name. And it means permanent.
I did not know this. This is good stuff.
So you need to dive into this a little bit.
Okay, I'll do that.
It's tease. All right.
Yeah, I'm already on it.
And Abel's name is Hevel. That's Abel's name. And it's better translated impermanence. So everything that we try to acquire is evil or vain, but it's impermanent.
Yeah.
Abel's name is breath or vapor or impermanence. So even good things can be impermanent.
Right.
Ultimately, this power snuffs out, life. And so I love the way in all of your books, actually, Brian, I think at least the ones I've read, you're constantly battling for a loving God who acts consistently in love at all times with his whole history with creation, right? And people. So I love that. So your chapter on God on the gallows.
Yeah.
And
that's a brutal chapter.
Right. How do we deal with the evil and the suffering in this world in the face of a good God that has any kind of power at all?
This is Christianity at its most vulnerable.
The only answer. And you brought out the brother Karamazov and the night. Elie
Wiesel,
night. Brilliant. I like the way you did that. And then what's the only answer that could possibly exist is kind of how you ended that chapter.
Yeah. And I don't know that it's fully an answer.
Right.
But it's the best one we have. So what we're talking about, just to sum up real quick, for those that might not know, we're talking about theodicy, which is the attempt to reconcile the Christian claim that God is good and powerful, benevolent, and yet the reality of suffering, unjust suffering. How do we reconcile that? Well, in one sense, Christians immediately make some kind, and I think you have to do this, some kind of appeal to actual radical freedom. That if God is going to create beings that are truly authentic and not just an extension of God's own will, there has to be radical freedom. But radical freedom opens the door for everything. So free will. That doesn't answer every question because you have issues of natural evil that don't seem to involve any will, but you have floods and tornadoes and stuff like that. But we make an appeal to free will. And then at the far end, way at the end of the line, we make an appeal to an eschatological hope where every tear is wiped away. There's no more sorrow, no more sighing, no more death, no more pain. Okay, fine. We have an alpha of freedom, and we have an omega of all things shall be well, and all things shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. But in between, we have the tau of the cross. That if radical freedom, which is necessary for authentic being, opens the door for unjust suffering, God does not exempt himself from it, but participates in it fully with us in Christ. God does not remain aloof. God enters into our world of sorrow and suffering. Indeed, he is a man of sorrows, deeply, deeply acquainted with grief. And I don't know exactly how it works. There's things that we know do work that we don't know how. At least that's the way it is with me. I hardly know how my car works, but I drive it every day. I know that people throughout the centuries have found solace by considering Jesus Christ crucified, sometimes by literally looking at images of this one who hangs in solidarity with all human suffering. And then there's this interesting verse in 1 Peter where the apostle says, by his wounds we are healed. That when we bring our woundedness to the wounds of Christ, it does not multiply woundedness, but tends toward healing. Again, I don't know if I can explain exactly how that happens, but I can testify that it does happen. And so I think probably the only thing that approaches a satisfactory theodicy that I know of, maybe somebody knows of one I don't know of, is that ultimately, if in this period of time, this is not eternity, but this is time, in these moments when we suffer, God does not exempt himself. God is not aloof, and we are not alone. God chooses to suffer with us.
I think it's one of the ways I understand the cross is God's solidarity with all suffering.
Yes.
In this world.
Yeah. And the title of that chapter comes from this,
from the Eli.
Yeah, this brutal episode in Elie Wiesel's night when a young child is being hung at Auschwitz. And because the child is so light, the child doesn't die quickly, but dangles from the noose for a long time. And he hears a voice among the Jewish prisoners that are forced to watch this atrocity saying, "Where is God?" And the voice within Elie Wiesel answers, "I'll tell you where God is. He's right there. He's hanging on the gallows," by which Elie Wiesel actually meant, my faith in God is dying right here.
Dead.
But that's not the end of the story, right? Because his faith in God recovered. In midlife, it returned. And there was a resurrection of his faith in God. Then I play with that, I think, very reverently, but I do play with it that, well, you're right. Where is God in that kind of suffering? God is on the gallows. Yeah. Because Christ was.
Yeah.
On the gallows.
And you referenced the crucified God, the work of
Moltmann.
Yeah. Man, so many great chapters, Brian. A grotesque beauty. Give us a little bit of the history of how long it took the church to start holding on to this image of the cross.
Yeah. Well, the cross was always talked about, preached, proclaimed, sung about. The sign of the cross is first century. I mean, I think they first did it like this. But the sign of the cross is first century. And of course, all the hymns, sermons, writings, the cross is central. They did not depict the cross in image. Not until after crucifixion was banned in the Roman Empire in the 4th century. I think that was simply because they were still too close to it. And as long as crucifixion was still publicly practiced, that was too provocative. And so it wasn't until the 4th century. And then when crucifixes, I should say, began to appear, the first style is Christ is generally presented in a very regal fashion. Suffering's absent. You don't see suffering. Christ is more in front of the cross than upon the cross. Very often he's fully clothed in a royal Byzantine style robe with a crown. And this is a good theological move, by the way, to see the cross as the throne of Christ. That's all completely legitimate, but they're still not depicting the agony and the sorrow and the suffering of Christ. Christ is they are connecting the cross with the enthronement of Christ, but they're leaving out any depiction of the suffering. It isn't until about the 10th century that you begin to have more common depictions. And one of the most famous one is the Garo crucifix, which comes from around, I think, 970, AD 970. And the bishop there, this is in This is in Cologne, Germany. The Bishop of Cologne was commissioning a new cathedral, and along with that, he wanted a new central crucifix. And this was one of the first, at least well-known, moves towards more realism, where Christ is dead upon the cross, and you see that this is someone who has actually, in fact, suffered. And so it took a long time to get there. But in that chapter, part of what I'm dealing with is how is it that we have arrived at the place where we can depict the crucifixion, which, come on, it's ghastly, brutal. It's ugly, it's abhorrent, but we've learned to depict it in terms of beauty. And in that book, in that chapter, I open with talking about this right here. This is my Russian Orthodox cross icon that sits right here on my writing desk. And if you look at it,
by the way,
yeah, there it is. That's what this is. If you just look at it, I think there's an initial response among most people. Go, oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. And it is. It's beautiful. But there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 scenes here, 4 of which the subject matter is torture and death. So have we made a mistake in depicting Christ crucified in terms of beauty? And I say no. If we had a journalistic photograph of the events of Good Friday, somebody, we'll work with anachronisms here. Someone went out from the Jerusalem Post, took a picture of what's going on at Golgotha on that day, and it had been passed down through the centuries. If we had a journalistic photograph of Christ crucified, we might look at it once, regret that we had, and never look at it again. It would just, it's ugly, it's horrible, horrible. And that's true. So have the artists made a mistake? No, they have not. The role of the artist is not that of the journalist. The journalist deals with the raw data. And the raw data at Good Friday is simply, a Jewish Galilean was crucified by Pontius Pilate, and it's all ugly. But that's not all that's going on there, because behind the raw data is the salvation of the world, is the love of God, is grace unbounded. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And so in that chapter, I mentioned Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night, very famous painting of Van Gogh's with its swirls of stars and all of that. Mm-hmm. Is that a journalistic depiction of literally what a starry night looks like? No, but that isn't. But Van Gogh's not a journalist. He's not an astronomer. He's an artist. And the role of the artist is to alert us to what we may have overlooked. Mm. And Van Gogh is shouting at us from his canvas saying, wake up, pay attention. There's beauty all around you. Don't miss it. Mm. And what we see on Van Gogh's canvas that is Starry Night is what we should experience in our soul when we behold the grandeur and majesty of the Starry Night. And when artists depict Christ crucified in terms of beauty, they're saying, wake up, pay attention. There's more going on here than just a Roman governor crucifying a Jewish prophet. The love of God is present here. The world is being saved here. Death is being conquered here. War is being abolished here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the artists have actually, they've done something theologically sound, but it should also just speak to us in a profound way that if crucifixion can be now depicted in terms of beauty, everything can be redeemed. And if you can redeem that, if crucifixion can become beautiful, everything can become beautiful.
Yeah. And I love that. And I don't want to, this is a 1 minute rabbit hole, but like growing up evangelical Protestant,
mm-hmm.
So Jesus suffering on the cross, we have an empty cross.
Yeah.
Obviously there's theology behind that. And then obviously I was taught, the Catholic view is Christ is on the cross. Why? Because every mass he's re-crucified again and again and again and again and again. But I think there's a deeper thing that you're bringing out here that's deeper than that, regardless of your Lord's Supper view. What?
Yeah.
Your community.
I mean, I hear Protestants will say, well, he's not on the cross now. And I'll say, well, he's not in a manger now either, but you have a nativity set at Christmas. He was on that cross. I'm not here to debate one or the other, but I will say this, that there is a difference between an abstract cross and a crucifix. The difference is, when you look at a crucifix, you know there's a story there. You go, whoa, something's happening here. I'm not saying I'm against an abstract cross. For one thing, it's a lot easier to draw. I mean, you don't have to be an artist, there you go, got your cross. So I'm for it. We have both in our church. We have some crucifixes, we have crosses. But to keep it as a story, I think is a appropriate move. Let's not, don't let the cross become merely sanitized into a sign in an atonement equation. That's very sterile. Let's keep it storied, and let's let the story speak to us, and not just in one way. So that when we depict Christ as regal upon the cross, that's part of the story. That's true, but it's not all the story. So that when we depict Christ suffering on the cross, that's also true. When we depict Christ peaceful and serene upon the cross, there's theological truth there. Tell it that way. When we depict Christ in great agony, like in the Eisenheim altarpiece by Matthias Grunwald, that's also part of it. So, yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. So the chapter, the lynching of the Son of Man, the way you brought out James Cone, great work, the cross and the lynching tree. And then I love the way you brought out the Jewish songwriter who wrote Strange Fruit, and then how Billie Holiday covered that. And by the way, I love that Billie Holiday song. That's such a holy crud. But oh my gosh, Americans don't understand this, Brian. Us white people who grew up evangelical, we don't understand the miracle of the black church in America. Is
the miracle of the black church
in America is
that America didn't suffer violent racial black uprisings against their white overlords is entirely attributable to the black church.
Unbelievable. Dive into that just a bit.
Well, that we haven't had, 2 centuries of reprisals and guerrilla movements and violent attacks upon white supremacy from the black community is entirely attributable to the black church that taught them the way of Christ, the way of grace, the way of mercy, the way of overcoming but not being overcome by evil, overcoming evil with good. Yes. And then that chapter, this is just me. And I put in a few of my own ideas, but I'm mostly just trying to step off the stage and say, James Cone, come and talk. Because I just know there's a certain amount of people that will read something from me that aren't going to pick up The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone. So, and that's just me stepping aside and saying, James, preach a little bit here.
Right. I love that. White American evangelicals don't understand this.
Yeah.
At all, hardly. And some do, obviously. I'm generalizing, but holy crud.
And the other thing that I do in that chapter, and I think this is powerful, is the word cross and crucifix and crucifixion have become so entirely associated with Christ, I guess, rightfully so, that it's largely lost any scent or hint of scandal. Lynching has not experienced that. So I play around with Paul saying things like, I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him lynched. I am lynched with Christ. We preached Christ lynched. A stumbling block to whites and foolishness to blacks, or something. I play with it like that. And the way that the word lynch lands in our ears is probably quite similar to the way people thought about crucifixion in the first century. So it does help recover the scandal of it.
Yeah. And 1880 to 1940, you point out there was at least 5,000 or more lynching done by white people.
And what people don't know is that these were not clandestine events out in the woods somewhere. These were public events that were often advertised, and people would come, and they were. And I explain in maybe the previous chapter, I can't remember the exact order of the chapters, why when people were there, they had no sense of guilt, and that these were not grim affairs. People were jovial. There was a great sense of community and camaraderie. They believed they were doing the right thing. It's all because they had come under the sway of the Satan and the scapegoat mechanism that I talk about in the book as well. But if you just see the pictures, and we have some of these, they're hard to look at. If you look at the photographs of lynchings from the 30s, 20s and 30s especially, by the time of photography was quite common, the thing that always stands out the most to me is that I can't find in any of the white onlookers any anguish, any conflicted emotions. They seem to be happy, self-confident, undisturbed. And that's disturbing. Yeah,
that is so disturbing.
But there's a chapter that explains why that is, what that phenomenon is. That's the Gerardian chapter.
Yeah, and I love that too. And you got to meet him.
Yeah. I spent a day at his house in Stanford.
How cool is that?
It was like one of the coolest things I've ever done. It was there with another friend, and
just Renee. Tell folks real quick.
Rene Gerard is one of the seminal thinkers of the 20th century. He's French. He was born in Avignon, France in 1925 on Christmas Day. Did most of his, nearly all of his academic work in the United States, where he held posts at Duke, University of Indiana. I don't remember all, but he was like 20 or 30 years at Stanford, and he is the one that gives us the concept of mimetic rivalry and the scapegoat mechanism to deal with it, and how this is the origin of archaic religion. Again, I'm not going to try to summarize it here. They can read the chapter, but he's one of the French immortals. This is, the greatest minds in French history can be elected to this honorary society. They're called the French Immortals. And I spent a day in his house with him and his wife, Martha, and had lunch with him and asked him a million questions. And he was totally gracious the whole time, and was very friendly and answered all the questions, and didn't seem like we were bugging him too much, I don't think. That's so cool. I have several pictures. I have a picture, even when we were driving away, he walked out onto the front step and was waving at us as we drove away.
Yeah. That's great. Well, just as an aside, I'd encourage, if you're a deep thinker and listener, check out James Cone, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. That the Black liberation theologians in America are worth listening and hearing. And so I'm a fan of the current restorative justice movement. There's Center for Conflict Resolution here in Kansas City. One of my board members is the chairman of the board for Center for Conflict, which is a restorative justice work here in Kansas City, who practicing not punishing justice, but restorative justice, which I think is the heart of God. Right.
I touched on this earlier, that Americans have this very unfortunate habit of mentally associating justice with punishment. Look, punishment may be a part of a restorative process, but punishment for the sake of punishment is never justice. That's not justice. That's retribution. That's vengeance.
Right. And it heals.
Justice means to rectify, to set things right. And in God's vision of justice, all things are to be set right. All things are to be set, not just, punishment. Well, that punishment may indeed be a part of a rectifying process, but it's not the end. And punishment for the sake of punishment is never justice. So even when we say justice, we should not think punishment. We should think setting things right.
Well, in the Hebrew word mishpat, that's translated justice, is is usually about the power elite oppressed.
It's usually about economics is what it usually is.
But the marginalized, the oppressed, the poor, the most vulnerable in society, who are made worse by those in power. And that,
So Isaiah says, look, you're joining property to property to property to property, expanding all of your holdings. And these people here don't even have enough to eat. They don't have anywhere to live. We need justice. And what he means is this isn't right. We need to change the system. That's Isaiah.
That's right. That's right. Okay, I'm gonna read a quote from one of my favorite new authors. All right. This is the Lamb upon the Throne chapter. If the violence of Revelation is literal, then in the end, God literally saves the world with violence. Not a violence endured, but a violence inflicted. This distorts Christ into a conqueror who is not all that different from Genghis Khan. A misreading of the apocalypse gives us an eschatology that poisons the whole gospel story. We end up with the Jesus of the Sermon on the Mount repudiating his own teaching as he says his enemies, as he slays his enemies by the millions. Christ crucified is abandoned for the pagan vision of a warrior God. My new series I'm starting is called Resurrecting the Sermon on the Mount.
Great.
How many times, there's a theology that maybe you grew up with this, that says the Sermon on the Mount isn't even for right now. It's for the millennial. So we said,
I hadn't heard that, but that's terrible.
Dispensationalists teach that
my goodness,
the Sermon on the Mount is only for the millennial reign of
Christ. The judgment seat of Christ is going to be awkward for them.
That's the teaching of dispensationalism, Brian.
It's terrible.
Yeah. So I love the way that you just, in all of your books, you're drilling that home. You're trying to bring the uncontrolling love of God into the union with the Son and all that God does through the Son. That's powerful. And it's a needed message for the church today. As we look at politics today, Christian nationalism, as you've been beating the drum for that for a long time. Yeah. Yeah. The church, when it's been in power throughout 2,000 years of Christian history, has acted almost the opposite of Jesus.
Yeah.
But when the church is the minority,
now you're into one ring to rule them all chapter.
But when the church is a persecuted minority, it usually it's more like Jesus. So,
ain't it the truth?
Oh my gosh. But we can't, the world out there right now, the media out there right now, we so many want a Christian strongman, right? Oh my gosh. And he'll do it by force and power and bring the kingdom in by violence and power. The opposite of what Jesus.
Yeah. There's a little bit Lamb upon the Throne, which deals with how we see the cross in the book of Revelation and how the recurring 28 times the recurring image is the slaughtered lamb. But you're also riffing a little bit off of chapter 9, which is the one ring to rule them all, my Tolkien chapter.
Yeah. I blended the two, but
they all go together. They all go together.
You inserted the slain lamb.
Yeah.
Primary theme of the book of Revelation.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah. And
so people say, let me just play with this a minute. I hear this all the time. Well, he came the first time as a lamb. He's coming back as a lion. Mm-hmm. I said, where do you get that? Well, in the book of Revelation, I said, there's no lion. Well, yes, there is. No, there's not. What there is there's this quest to find one who is worthy to open the scroll, to break the seals and open the scroll and release God's redemptive purpose for humanity. And the search is made and no one's found worthy. And John is weeping greatly, But then one of the elders says, no. Look, the Lion of the tribe of Judah has overcome and is worthy. The Lion, this is a Messianic title. the king in the line of David, the Lion of the tribe of Judah is overcome. Look, the lion, look, and we look, and what do we see? Do we see we do not see a lion. There is no lion. What we see is a slaughtered lamb, a little lamb, a lambkin, a little lamb with a slit throat, but yet standing. So it's a picture of death and resurrection together. And this is one of the comedic elements in the book of Revelation. So if we're in the African savannah and we know there's lions about and we're nervous, and I say, Fred, look, a lion. And you turn and look, and I'm pointing at a little lamb. Well, it's a joke. And in one sense, the little lamb is the joke played on the beasts in the book of Revelation, that these beasts are not conquered by other beasts, not conquered by a mighty beastly lion, but by a little lamb. They overcame him by the blood of the lamb and the word of their testimony, and they loved not their life even unto death. And now I'm reaching.
Yeah. So we're really out of time, but I want your last part of the book, a theopoetics of the cross.
Yeah.
And I love the way you played with the third day trees created, the 3 trillion trees.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of write some poetry and you tie that into some dream sequences.
Yeah.
Are those real dreams?
Yeah, those are real dreams. I could have used that as like a literary device, but no, I actually had those dreams.
Okay. Yeah. I was wondering if it was just a literary device or.
No, I really had those dreams.
And then these 3 poems that you wrote that start out with 3 trillion trees,
mm-hmm.
third day of creation, third day resurrection, and ending with the one tree out of the 3 trillion trees that on the third day became the wood between the worlds.
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful way to end this. I loved it.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, we could talk for more hours, but great job. Great job.
Thank you, Fred. I love chatting with you, and thank you for your kindness and inviting me on. And
if you want to see the cross through 18 different lenses, there's 18 chapters here plus
19.
Oh, 19 plus 9. Okay. Yeah. If you want to see the cross through 19 different lenses with rich stories tied to multiple themes that are in the cross, check out this book. You will be inspired, and I think your love for what God has done through Jesus in the crosses will be restored to some degree or another, right?
Yeah.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in to Spirituality Adventures. We appreciate it. If you haven't already gone to the website, signed up for our email, and become a team supporter, we would greatly appreciate it. So do so if you haven't done so already. And thanks for tuning in and listening. We'll see you next time, and have a wonderful Holy Week, everybody, as you journey through this amazing week of the life of Christ. God bless. Thanks, Brian. Hey, you made it to the end. Thanks for listening all the way through on this episode. By the way, if you're not already a supporter, go to spiritualityadventures.com, sign up for one of our monthly supports, and you will receive our bonus content. You'll receive lots of interesting information about our guests. Many of our musicians will do special bonus songs and record a song. So I want to encourage you to do that. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Be sure and subscribe. Be sure and share any of the episodes that you like. And be sure to make comments if you like them as well. This helps us get Spirituality Adventures out there to more listeners, more watchers. So whatever platform you're using, subscribe, like, share, make comments, and go to our website, sign up for our team, and be a part of the team support. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.